Hello, welcome to the Book Gallery, a series of conversations with writers and scholars of imagination and erudition. I'm your host, Luke Sheehan, editor of the University Bookman. Founded by Russell Kirk, the University Bookman redeems the time by identifying and discussing books that diagnose the modern age and support a renewal of culture and the common good. Voluntary associations have existed at least since Socrates and his students and long before that. Nowhere but in America, as Alexis de Tocqueville observed, has the voluntary association been made the primary means of self-government. Americans solved economic, social, and political problems, large and small, through voluntary associations, taking a vast array of legal forms. Unfortunately, that mode of American self-government has long been in decline. When writing my own book on freedom of association, I often wished for a thorough history of the voluntary association in America to which I could refer, but no such history existed. Robert Putnam's work discusses mostly associations in the 20th century, but what about the founding era? What was Tocqueville's America really like in an empirical sense? What about after the Civil War, or the Industrial Era, or the Progressive Era? Well, I've got some good news. That history has finally been written. I am joined by Robert Wright, author of Liberty Lost, The Rise and Demise of Voluntary Association in America Since Its Founding. Robert Wright is a lecturer in economics at Central Michigan University. He is the co-author or co-editor of over 24 major books, book series, and edited collections, including The Best of Thomas Paine and Financial Exclusion. He has also co-authored numerous articles for important journals, including American Economic Review, Business History Review, Independent Review, the Journal of Private Enterprise, the Review of Finance, and Southern Economic Review, all major in the big leagues in terms of economic scholarship. Dr. Wright, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Luke.
Let's start with some framing. So you frame your discussion of the voluntary association in terms of the third sector. What is the third sector? Why is it the third?
Yeah, well, actually, I wish it was the first, but um, the the other two sectors are the for-profit commercial sector and government. Nonprofits constitute the third sector, as it's sometimes called, but that's the third sector goes by many other names, like the independent sector, um, the sector nobody knows. There's a whole list of them in the book, uh, and it's partly because people just don't think about it all that often, especially these days. And basically, since this whole New Deal process of enlarging the government continuously got started, um, people think, oh, there's a problem, and the Good Samaritan story in the Bible, the individual helps the person who's injured. um, Now the Good Samaritan is somebody who runs into town and gets a government official to go help, so sort of thing. So it's easy to forget that it's out there, and it's so diverse. And it's surprisingly large, um, but even today. But yeah, it's just not something that makes the news all the time, right? You see your stock fluctuations in the Wall Street Journal, and New York Times and WAPO will cover government policy changes, things like that. But where do you learn about what's happening in the nonprofit sector? The Chronicle of Philanthropy, which, what, 14 people subscribe to at this point?
That's right.
It's just there's no one big go-to place. And of course, but usually when the third sector makes the news now, it's for bad things, for somebody caught skimming or something. But all the good work that's done every day, it just goes largely unseen and unheard about. It's kind of like Gandhi said, when he was talking about how history's made, and he said, two brothers get together and share a meal and conversation, good time, and then they part. That doesn't end up in the newspaper.
That's right.
It's when one bashes the other one over the head that it ends up in the newspaper, right? So the third sector is just it's very important, but it just sits there quietly doing its job.
Right. Yeah, it seems like the way we talk about it is it is the one that we forget about. We know what it means to have the urge to make profit, know what it means to have the will to power. We see those all the time. But the urge to serve is actually fairly widespread in our history, and yet it's not the one that gets covered most of the time, unless, of course, that's somehow been betrayed. Uh, you also talk in there about what's interesting about the third sector is it is organized differently. So you describe the state as being organized uh, vertically, those in power and those without power, but the relationship of those in the third sector is horizontal. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, a big chunk of the third sector are organizations that used to call themselves, and occasionally still do, but back in the day, definitely many of them called themselves fraternals, right? For fraternity, for brothers, right? Or they called themselves sororals if they were gender based for females. And there were even a few that called themselves maternals, which I guess is starting to get a little bit hierarchical. But no one really thinks about their moms lording it over them. Dads more so, but not moms so much, and definitely not sisters or brothers. It's more a meeting of peers to work together towards a shared goal rather than somebody up here saying, this is what you must do down here, which is what you get in government.
Yeah, and I love you tell a story about one of the when there's the rise of these 19th century fraternal organizations, it made travel a lot easier because you knew that anywhere you went, there was a lodge or a brother who could put you up, and suddenly the world was open to the young men who joined these organizations.
That's right. Like the Masons, the Society of Odd Fellows, the what was it called, the Red Men Lodge, uh, and and various others. Uh, a lot of times the temperance organizations would also help out fellow people who had taken the pledge. Because people who taken the pledge, they don't want to lodge in a tavern for the night. There are people drinking there, right? So you'd help out a fellow temperance brother, and make accommodations for the evening. Of course, that was back at a time when people would do that commonly. Uh, Sometimes even share the same bed,
Right.
but definitely would make room someplace in the house or in a nice cozy barn. It was quite common back then. So sort of like Airbnb today, except it was based more on you would maybe tip your host, give them a little something to cover their troubles and their food, or split some wood in the morning, sort of thing.
Right.
But yeah, sort of like an early version of Airbnb, but based around some cohesiveness of being in the same fraternal or some other nonprofit organization.
And you also, another part of your framing of your book is you describe America as having a growth diamond. What is that?
That is a heuristic device that I developed with Richard Silla and George David Smith at the Stern School of Business back in the aughts. And we were trying to get MBA students to understand why some countries have high per capita incomes and many have low per capita incomes, and there are very few in between. And what we hit upon was what we framed is like a baseball diamond, where every country that uh, ends up getting a government for whatever reason, and that's the tricky part. But whenever a country gets a government that protects that essential human rights triad of life, liberty, and property. Very soon, modern financial system springs up. And that modern financial system supports a system of open access entrepreneurship, which includes both non-profit and for-profit entrepreneurs, innovators. And of course, many of them fail, especially on the commercial side. But those who succeed begin to scale up. And that leads to third base, the modern manager, the individuals who can run large, complex organizations efficiently. And so once that government that protects life, liberty, and property is in place, then the rest of people have incentives to do the rest of these things. You have an incentive to form a commercial bank if you believe that the government is going to protect you from outside invaders and is going to protect you from bank robbers. And most importantly of all, is going to protect you from the government itself expropriating those resources, right? So once people believe that, as they did by the early 1790s in the United States, then people began to form banks and to issue stocks, shares in for-profit business concerns. Once that's in place, then you have financing available for experimentation, entrepreneurs, innovators. And then it just plays out in the marketplace, whether it's on the commercial side or the nonprofit side. Right. If you come up with an idea of helping some group and people don't think that group is worthy of charity, then you're not going to collect much in donations and you'll fold. But if people do believe that they're worthy and that your organization can help them, then they'll make donations, and you can use the financial system to help to manage the efficiency of that intermediation between givers and recipients. And then you can, scale up. If it's an industry, that's kind of obvious. But many of these fraternals, like we were talking about, and the temperance organizations and the abolition societies, they also scaled up. They did it usually through a chapter system where local folks would organize a chapter and then apply for membership in a state organization or a national organization. Sometimes the state organizations would then turn around and they would join a national organization. So there were temperance societies in the antebellum U.S. that had over 1 million members at one point, not from a top down, but from a bottom up. Yes, we'd all like to be part of this idea of reforming morally by abstaining from intoxicating liquors.
Right. Where does this idea of a voluntary association originate? So you have the state.
I think it originates with humanity, though it's difficult to get archaeological evidence of these things, but certainly by the time of Christ, they're known in the Roman world, and the Christian church, and where we get the word corporation from is from the corpus, is from the body of Christ. They saw voluntary association not just in the church, but to do good works as key, and to salvation. And they wanted to form organizations that would outlast their lifetimes, and so they started to develop the corporate form that we know today. And there's a wonderful book, if anyone's interested in the details, by Amanda Porterfield on this topic, where she takes us from the Pauline era of the church, all the way up into into the 20th century. The corporate spirit, it's called.
Corporate spirits.
Yeah, wonderful title.
Yeah. So this is what's interesting is that, yeah, it develops. I mean, it seems to me it's they're pretty early in history. I mean, once we have written records, we
It's
have
there.
Plato and Socrates, we start
Yeah,
seeing that we're seeing groups,
yeah.
dinner clubs in
It,
Rome, and it seems like it gets going pretty quick.
it's like slavery. We're pretty sure that it started with humanity. We just what is there in the archaeological record? Well, in the archaeological record, we've actually found coffles made of iron that could serve no other purpose than anyone can figure out other than to physically restrain other human beings, right? But
Right.
where are you going to get that sort of evidence from, for a voluntary association,
Right.
right? But if something is around at the first writings, it must have been around for a while, right?
It's a fair
Like
assumption.
religion
Right.
was around definitely before there was writing.
Right.
The details we'll probably never know, but yeah, it was almost certainly around. So they're almost certainly voluntary associates. I suppose you could. Usually, I think of tribes or clans, and I have modeled them before as corporations, and I was thinking of them as for-profit corporations, but they could be nonprofit really as well, and maybe nonprofit is the way to model them because nonprofit means that there's no residual claimants to an organization's assets,
Right.
right? So, yeah, would there be any residual claimants to a tribe or a clan? Huh. Interesting
Right.
question.
Right. And there's a lot to go into there. Let's get to the American founding though. So we have the growth
Right.
diamonds. We've got things are actually doing pretty well by the 1790s. A new constitution is on the books from 1787 or 88. Kind of let's get into kind of the problem with the English laws in the 1770s and 1780s that caused the revolution. And then kind of how some of those problems were solved with the state constitutions and the federal constitution.
Well, yeah, we're coming up on the whatever it's called, the 250th anniversary of the founding of the nation, and I doubt that you remember 1776. Excuse me, yeah, you definitely don't remember 1776. 1976. I
I do
have some
not.
vague recollections of some tall ships or something in New York Harbor that I saw on the 6-inch black and white television screen. But yeah, that's coming up, and I've been working on a book for the past 22 years on the coming of the American Revolution. And I'm convinced that it was due to British monetary policy. They basically cut off both major means of final means of payment or cash, uh, which would be gold and silver coins and bills of credit or a fiat paper money system. Uh, they cut off the specie by really increasing enforcement of various trade laws. Some new, others have been on the books before, but not really enforced. And the colonists simply ran out of money in the sense of some final means of payment, right? So I owe you a debt because of stuff that I've taken out of your store for the last 2 years that you've written down in an account book, and there's nothing for me to pay you with. Uh, and so finally, you might end up suing me, and then my property being sold at sheriff's sale. And this is what happened in the 1763, basically throughout the rest of the the Revolutionary period. There wasn't enough medium of exchange because of the British government. And so people were losing their homes and their businesses and their liberty, because back then, if you couldn't, if the sale of your property didn't raise enough money to settle your debts, and they never did because there was nobody there to buy the property because nobody had any money, you were thrown in debtor's prison. And John Adams, 20 years, 30 years after the revolution, said, yeah, we all started to feel like, is it Macbeth? Where we were afraid our mother was going to come in and dash our brains out. That's how the colonists felt, because the British just kept up all these rules that prevented the colonists' economy from functioning effectively. And one of the many ways that the colonists tried to get out from under that was to form banks. And as soon as they tried, bam, the British pulled out, this old law about the Bubble Act, that said you can't form a bank without approval of the government, and approval was never forthcoming.
Right.
So the colonists are just kind of stuck. And I'm one of the reasons that they declared independence, and one of the first things they did after they declared independence was to issue bills of credit, to issue fiat paper money, and then of course the infamous Continentals, and they got a little punch drunk over it, that led to bad outcomes. But when the Continental died, they formed banks like the Bank of North America, which stabilized the monetary system enough to round out and end the war. But another thing that the colonists tried to do, because they didn't have sufficient means of final payment, was non-importation acts. So a bunch of merchants would voluntarily associate, write up, a contract basically saying, I'm not going to import anything from Britain if you don't import anything from Britain. And so this was one of the first, sort of radical political voluntary associations for the Stamp Act, and then again for the Townshend duties. And that leads to all of the voluntary committees of correspondence and whatnot that help to coordinate independence and the initial stages of the rebellion. Right. So you could say America was born in voluntary associations. Yeah, radical ones.
Right.
Which is why in the 1790s, when the Democrat Republicans, the Jeffersonian types, started to form nonprofit associations, the Democrat societies, the Federalists went ape crazy, because they thought that this was just gearing up for another revolution, right? And the Democrat Republicans went nuts over the Society of the Cincinnati,
right?
Because they thought that by the 1830s we start to see like the Anti-Masons, which is a voluntary association aimed at another voluntary association that it thought had too much power. Of course, it was all overblown, because voluntary association, the ones that are formally incorporated, which are the ones that have left most of the record, the written record for us to ponder over, and they were I'm looking for the right words here. They were just sub municipalities, basically. They existed because they had this power, this corporate charter bestowed upon them by the government. The
Right.
government could take that corporate charter away if they were to ever become truly rebellious or
Right.
truly a threat, right? Now, the you might argue that even without the corporate charter, the bonds that had been formed in that period would still exist, and it could still do untoward things, but it would lose a lot of its financial power. The reason to get a corporate charter was to make sure that any donations that were received were secure.
And the this social impulse, it picks up in the committees of correspondence, which are up and down the Eastern Seaboard, and then it continues. I mean, that's actually it exists prior to the revolution. I think Paul Revere was the member of a as a boy was the member of a bell ringing society in the 1750s. Ben Franklin founded a bunch of organizations actually,
Yep.
some for self improvement, the American Philosophical Society, and it continues to ramp up as we talked about politically in the 1790s, but really across all domains into the 19th century. So that by 1837, you have 1 in every 3 males is a member of at least one voluntary association. So they're endemic, especially in the North. And this is kind of an interesting distinction. Why is it that the South didn't develop them as 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 strongly?
Well, it could very well be because of the slaveocracy, because large slave owners wanted to pit uh, what Buckram, what Hinton Helper called white trash, wanted to pit them against slaves. So they didn't want the poor whites to be educated. They didn't want the poor whites to be terribly organized. They wanted the poor whites to look to them for leadership and guidance, so that they could control them, control their votes, control the way they behaved. So it kind of ran against the slaveholders' perceived interest to, they're not going to form certainly an academy for poor whites in the South to help them to improve their life, because they didn't want them improving. They wanted them to be there as this counterbalance against their sometimes volatile laborers.
Right.
Yeah, and to run slave patrols at night and so on and so forth. And I found that for profit corporations as well. The North had more, generally speaking, in per capita terms, with Georgia being the exception in both cases.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Georgia had a lot. Now, something else. I think some of the southern states also didn't even incorporate churches, right?
Yeah, like Virginia, because of their battles over the Anglican Church, um, did not incorporate churches, so they wouldn't be in the incorporation numbers. Now they still had churches, obviously,
Right.
but the idea behind incorporation was that donors could give, relatively assured that the money would not be dissipated in other causes or into other people's pockets, right? It's an assurance because the corporation it lives as long as it wants to, uh, which can be years or decades or centuries. And there were some nonprofits, for example, certainly many churches, but also other types of nonprofits formed in the antebellum period that still exist today, like the YMCA.
Right.
It's vastly different from what it used to be, but it still exists. I talk about the not the abolition societies, the American Colonization Society lasted into the 1960s. I discovered this as a graduate student. I was working under Bill Freeling, and he was amazed at it. And so it's always been in the back of my mind. And when I started to work on this project, I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. There's nothing really that they could do. There's no residual claimants to the assets that, and there was nothing for it to do either. So it's just sitting on this pot of cash.
Right.
Yeah, which by the way, a lot of people in the early republic and even today will say, "Oh, this is it's not money that's hoarded in a wall.
Right.
It was invested,
Right.
so it's still helping the economy. It's just that yeah, there was nothing towards the mission for it to do anymore, and finally the IRS made clear that a nonprofit can resolve itself by donating all of its funds to another nonprofit, and that's how it ended its existence.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I'm the treasurer of Historians Against Slavery, and we've been moribund basically since the pandemic, and we're trying to get fired back up again. If there's any historians out there who are interested in or any social scientists really, who are interested in studying past versions of slavery and using it to shed light on modern forms of slavery, we'd love to have you. But right now we're just sitting there, and one possibility is of this pot of money that I'm sitting on is that we'll just donate it to a modern anti-slavery group
Right.
in order to exit.
Right. And
Yeah,
these
I wish I could take the money, but
right.
yeah, it wouldn't be ethical or moral or legal. So
Right.
yeah,
Right. It really shows the yeah, the inherent staying power of these corporations, that they can kind of, by definition, they continue to exist.
that's right. So people are much more likely to donate to a corporation than to say a trust,
Right.
which is what a lot of a trust that is composed of one or two trustees, sort of thing, because it's much easier for them to steal the money, or much easier for the money to just sort of become lost in their estates after they die and whatnot. And that's why that statute of charitable uses controversy was interesting.
Right. Yeah,
It
let's talk
was
about that.
Yeah, it
What
was
was
this. It was a late Elizabethan statute, like 1601,
right.
that sort of codified a lot of the common law over charitable donations, right? So it tried to give people in Britain, some confidence that they weren't just giving into a black hole, that the money that they donated would go towards one of the purposes that the donor desired. Well, you come to after the revolution, and there are states that didn't explicitly say that that law was now part of American law for that state. So then you'd get legal cases arguing, hey, the statute of charitable uses does not apply here in Virginia. So this money does not actually belong to this trustee. It belongs to this person over here, sort of controversies. And of course, once you start to have that, then people think twice and thrice about donating to charities. And so there was one reason why Virginia uh, had a doctrine named after it, was because for a couple of decades it was pretty much a stickler, that the statute did not apply in Virginia. But finally, you get some good jurists like James Kent in New York, and eventually Joseph Story comes around to this, and they say um, donations made to trusts in America are based on American legal precedent and British common law, and this old British statute doesn't matter one way or another. So that kind of shored up shored up donors to trusts. But of course, one way around that was to formally incorporate, because then the formal corporation and its bylaws would be the determining factor in what happened to donations.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's get into some of the how should I put it, the great variety of associations that come into existence. So in 1825, there's this one American that you quote who says, "We have societies for everything," and that's about right. there's societies for everything, and a plethora of them. So we
You
have
mentioned the bell ringing already.
that's right, the bell ringing society, and then of course there's the anti-bell ringing societies that arise
Yep.
to counter the bell ringing societies.
Yep. There are some that were satirical. At least I think they were satirical, for like the Society for Preventing Women with Too Much Time on Their Hands from Sticking Their Nose into Everything. That's a rough paraphrase, but yeah,
Right.
pretty sure that one was satirical. But yeah, widespread music appreciation. There were societies for that, with formal incorporations too.
Right.
All right. So we're just seeing the biggest tip of the biggest ones, basically. Then underneath the surface, we can only pick up allusions to in diaries and letters and things like that. There's a whole bunch of voluntary associations that are not formally chartered,
Right.
and like sewing circles and supper clubs, and organizations that didn't need really to attract any assets. So there was no reason to go through formal incorporation and charter, because it's just people volunteering. And when people stop volunteering, well, then the association doesn't really exist anymore, and there's nothing to divide up anyway. Um,
Right.
but in terms of the formal one, yeah, some amazing ones, including in some states large numbers of private militias
Right.
incorporated as nonprofits.
Right. There's and there was, I mean, quite a few of them. I think your example is there was like petitions for 17 of these in the state of Maine. I mean, and 9 of them or something like that actually got through, or 7 of them or something like that. But
Yes, yeah,
that
yeah,
strikes me as a lot. Is there
yeah,
a lot
yeah,
of private militias?
and
That was just 1 year of
yes, one in
incorporations.
1 year. Right. And the if you were in a private militia company, and note the military, we think company, we think, Band of Brothers, Easy Company, that sort of thing, without really
Right.
thinking about why would the military have a division of itself called a company.
Right.
Yeah, well, it turns out that there were plenty of for-profit military uh, firms and nonprofit. And the militia, the incentive there was that you were exempted from the government militia if you were a member in good standing of one of these private militias. So they tended to be more elite units. So your cavalry, your artillery, grenadiers, that sort.
Right.
Uh, People who were happy to supply their own horse and their own rifle, their own sword, and so forth, just so they didn't have to rub elbows with the hoi polloi.
Right.
Every month it muster.
Right.
Um, and of course, there were social benefits to it too. Um, and these lasted, by the way, through the Civil War and into the Gilded Age. I really think it was the machine gun that ended these things,
Right.
um, because then you could lose your entire company in a few seconds.
Right.
Yeah, but in the antebellum period, yeah, they were quite strong. and allied, in a sense, with the fire brigades or the fire companies that would put out fires or try to. I just recently rewatched Gangs of New York.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, do you remember the scene where the fire companies are fighting each other rather than the? Yeah, apparently that actually happened until they got the incentive structure worked out. The
Right.
incentive structure was that the insurers would pay the first company on the scene, which is one of these economics things, right? When you first hear it, it's like, oh, that makes sense. We want to encourage the fire companies to get there as quickly as possible, right? So you pay the one who's first on the scene, but not if the companies start to fight each other in order to keep
Right.
them from getting there,
Right.
right? So, yeah, you got to be very careful with incentives because people tend to do precisely what they're incentivized to do. Which is why all of these nonprofits, and especially the charitable ones, the educational ones, the religious ones, the medical ones for there were some for women with postpartum, what we would call today postpartum depression. In some of the bigger cities like Philadelphia, there were charities specifically just to help those women.
Right.
And so the great thing about it was that nobody's being forced to support this cause or that cause or the other cause. You help out where you feel like there's the most need.
Right.
Right. So you're not voting. And of course, before the Civil War, it's all open ballot anyway. It always amazes me that they thought that there was any sort of democracy in the U.S. when you have open voting like that. But yeah, it's not, oh, you vote for somebody and then they join a legislative body, and then all kinds of junk happens, right? The stuff that you probably took entire courses in, right, for your PhD, right? With stuff getting stopped in committees, tabled, and people voting for things they really didn't agree with and voting against things they really did agree with, and just all the crazy shenanigans that goes on. I got into some of this for some previous projects where like legislators would leave so there wouldn't be a quorum, so they
Right.
couldn't hold a vote. Just so there's this mess that then occurs, and then a law comes out and says that you have to pay such and such in taxes to support such and such activities that you might not agree with, right?
Right.
So why not just allow people to support the causes that they feel are most in need of support? Yeah,
Makes sense. Yeah.
that it makes sense. And if there's hardly anyone who is interested in that cause, and they won't put up a lot of money, well, then nothing happens, and nothing should happen.
Well,
Yeah,
this is
but
what's so
if it's something
interesting
that
is
people really feel strongly about, then like abolition,
right.
you're going to get a lot of people involved. A lot of funds will flow that way. Uh, like for some of these missionary societies and these
Right.
tract societies where they print up Bibles as cheaply as possible. Major innovations in printing came about trying to get Bibles down to be affordable, and then they would give them away, and they attracted all kinds of donations because people believed in that.
Right.
Yeah,
I was fascinated by some of the some of these make sense. Some charities for orphans, but
yep.
there was a lot of concern for seamen as well, that I thought was was really interesting. That sailors were kind of a big target. Uh, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, well, because it's difficult. especially back then, there was a high mortality rate.
Right.
They're they don't really have a home,
Right.
or if they do have a home, they have a wife who doesn't see her husband for years on end, and that leads to all sorts of issues. And they tend not to be, the most highly educated or the best paid, unless they're privateers and it's wartime. But otherwise, they're just scraping by. Many of them early in the 19th century would end up being robbed. They would leave their money with like a landlord for safekeeping, and they'd go out on a voyage to China and come back 2 years later, and the landlord's absconded
Right.
with all the money, right? So that's why there were many of the early savings banks would mention sailors. There were some specifically just for sailors, to have a safe place to invest their funds. Being shipwrecked was a major concern of anyone who ever took to the ocean. Uh, the stories of cannibalism or dying of scurvy and whatnot really touch people. And so there was a voluntary association just to set up aid stations in like barrier islands that had not yet been built up by rich people in their summer homes, right? But were kind of desolate places where where their shipwrecks were frequent. They'd put up aid stations, kind of like northern cabins, way up in the Arctic.
Right.
People just build cabins, and if you need it, then you use it. So it was that sort of just leaving assets there in case anyone would be stranded and would need it. I don't know. Maybe they all read Robinson Crusoe.
Well, yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Now we could go through a ton of these. Self-improvement. So this is kind of interesting. The self-improvement societies, there's a lot of these around. We've talked a little bit about them, but it kind of indicates a sense not of rugged individualism, but of self-responsibility. You're responsible for how you turn out, but you need other people to get there. And so these societies
Exactly.
would form that you could join.
Exactly. Yes. Much like what are they, the 10 step program, 11 step program, 9 step programs? What are those step programs? So like the AA or the NA?
Right. 12 step, right?
12 step. Okay.
Yeah.
uh
I think that's right.
yeah, it was sort of like that. You're ultimately responsible for whether you drink too much or not, but that doesn't mean that you can't get help from other people. You can't
Right.
get support. Yeah. Um, so maybe you're 30 and you don't know how to read, but we can get you the help that you need. And once you learn how to read, you can start to attend Lyceum lectures,
Right.
for example, and listen to a lecture and go to the library. Uh, some were public, many were nonprofit, some were for profit. They worked kind of on like the Blockbuster model, if you remember that, where you
Right.
rent a video and then take the video back, where you could rent a book for a fee, and then return it, and then they'd give you a lot of the money back and just keep the rental fee. And if you never returned it, well, then they had your deposit as well. But most of them seem to be nonprofit, and tied into an academy or a university, um, a particular fraternal society. Um, a lot of the associations for improvement of agriculture or manufacturing would have libraries as well. So you could go, very specialized libraries, not general reading ones, but where you could go and learn, the proper techniques for planting corn or what have you.
Right. And for our listeners, we are open for questions, although I have a few more things I'd like to get through. Let's see, there's a ton we can go through on self-improvement. I love the lyceums. I mean, those were huge. That you call them as kind of the 19th century version of continuing education. I thought that was
Yes.
a good description.
Yes, and some of us, including myself, have been thinking about trying to get them back using
Right.
a format like this, where you would have a top notch speaker, and I won't mention any names, but not me, but uh, that would be delivered electronically, and that maybe people meeting physically throughout the whole country or throughout the whole world, and then having a face to face discussion afterwards
Right.
of the material presented. So yeah, that model could come back, but of course back then they didn't have Zoom. They were itinerant lyceum specialists even
Right.
arose, who made a living just going from one town to the next,
Yep.
giving lectures.
Right. And it's
Yeah.
one of Lincoln's famous speeches is was given delivered at the Young Men's Lyceum, and it was in Springfield, I think.
Oh
It's
yeah,
one of his
yes, yes.
super famous speeches, and it's his
Yep,
Lyceum address, and it was one of these where he went and delivered an address on slavery.
yep.
Uh, yeah, they were all over the place. The learned societies. I mentioned the American Philosophical Society, but the Academy of Natural Sciences, the McClurian Lyceum, tons of these arose in the 19th century, and they were huge.
American
Uh,
Antiquarian Society, and many of them still exist.
yeah. There was also cooperative improvement, mutual benefit societies, for example. So kind of giving, you call them club goods. Could you talk a little bit about these?
Sure. It's a form of insurance, except instead of there being a for-profit entity that is taking premiums and investing them and paying out claims, it's people who get together, usually because they have some affinity, like the same workplace, and they agree that if such and such conditions happen, that they will pay the worker who got sick or got maimed or what have you, that they would make payments to them uh, in a mutual way or a cooperative way. Uh, if someone had an accident at work, became ill, uh, they would mutually support each other. And it turns out that they were much more efficient than the corporations, because most people think, oh, I'm going to make a claim on this because it's just coming from this greedy corporation. But very few people will try to expropriate resources from their friends and neighbors in that way. So if they were truly sick, they would ask for the benefit, but you didn't get much. The term in the 19th century was malingering. You didn't get a bunch of people faking it or you know dragging it out, because they knew where the money was coming from. It was coming from Joe next door or
Right.
James down the way. Yeah, and I wouldn't want them doing that to me, so I'm not going to do it to them.
Right.
Yeah, so they didn't need a huge claims staff checking for fraud and things like that. So it was quite efficient.
Right. And you talk here about a lot of the critiques. We can get into some of the critiques, free writing and that sort of thing. But one critique was racism in these groups. But as it turns out, there was kind of a built-in mechanism that dealt with that. Could you talk a little bit about the mutual benefit societies that blacks formed for themselves?
Oh yeah, if anyone was excluded from any sort of nonprofit, there was no big barrier to them going off and forming their own. So blacks formed many, even some slaves. I found evidence of forming a voluntary association, not formally incorporated ones, obviously, but free blacks in the North and South formed and chartered voluntary associations, usually these of this mutual benefit type. You know, we are going to make sure that you get a proper burial,
Right.
for example, because it was a big fear. You didn't want to end up in a potter's field.
Right.
For poor people, you wanted a proper send off. So yeah, there's 100 of us in this community, and we all pledge that we're going to to pay up when one of us dies, and give us a proper burial.
Right. And you talked about how I think it was in New York where blacks were actually less likely than whites to end up in almshouses because their mutual benefit societies were so
We're so
effective.
we're so effective. We're so good. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. I mean, there's a lot of literature jumping forward to the Great Society, but there's a lot of literature that blacks in America were doing great until the Great Society came along,
Right.
unwound families and a lot of uh, these voluntary ties.
Yeah, when we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the decline, the liberty lost here.
Yes, yes, and it's getting late, isn't it?
Yeah, so
Uh,
let's get into this. What we've got a few questions too that are coming in, but let's start talking about decline. Some of the questions are dealing with revival, potential future revival. But what happened? Why is the vibrancy no longer there?
Big government happened, starting with the progressive era. We had in we had plenty of universities in the U.S., but we hit upon this notion of the German research university in the late 19th century and started to send uh, graduate students there to Germany to learn. And they learned a very different form of government. They learned about this top down, basically unchecked form of government that we know in the 20th century led very easily to authoritarianism. Yeah, but it's a state centric view of the world. If you ask some of these folks, who owns you, they would say the state rather than that you will own yourself. And they rejected natural rights. And then these students came back, they became professors, they started spitting out their own PhDs who also believed in this stuff. And by 1900 or so, you have this progressive movement going, and speeding all the way up through that leads to the New Deal. And that's what really broke the back of voluntary associations in the US, because you start to get this cycle of the government getting bigger, higher taxes, so people have less money to donate. And they also feel like there's less reason to donate, right?
Right.
In the 19th century, there's some, poor guy who had his leg blown off in the Civil War. You want to help that person. By the 1930s and later in the US, you see somebody like that, and you're like, go to your VA, go to the government and get help. Right? I gave it the office.
Right.
I paid my taxes. I don't want to deal with this stuff anymore. And it really started, some pernicious downward spiral. Churches became places where you go to like sing and pray, and it was just became all sort of spiritual. Where previously church, there was that, but there was also, and then afterwards we are going to help the community in some way. Well, starting in the 1930s, that started to change. Deacons became, they used to be intermediaries between church funds and mendicants of people who needed aid. And in many denominations, they became ushers. They just seated people, and people who used to put bills in the collection plate started to put coins in,
Right.
because they didn't have the money, or the church was, the donations weren't for the poor. The donations were just to run the church, keep the lights on, and pay the pastor or what have you, right? So that started a trend towards, less and less church attendance, because it was just not as compelling as it had once been. Except in some of those denominations that run their own social safety nets, like the Mormons, right, who tithe their members 10%, but also will help out Mormons who, in good standing, who get into financial straits, right? And they have all sorts of other, other outreach to poor more. But most of the other denominations, this was lost. Then we started to see governments starting in the 1960s, and this has increased to this day, where governments essentially sponsor nonprofits. You look at the nonprofits 990, and most of the money coming in comes from government grants. They're appendages to the government that the government finds useful for various reasons. Maybe to hide what it's doing, or maybe because the nonprofits don't have to follow government union rules, so they can get things done more efficiently than the government can. But they're not really third sector. They're more like sector 2.5. They're kind of in between, because they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them.
Right.
So if the government says jump, they say how high, instead of, is jumping really a good idea right now? Because
Right.
they want that next government grant hit. So now that's not to say there still aren't many good nonprofits out there, and charities and foundations, but it's not a panacea. Nothing's perfect, and because we pay so little attention to it, there's been some, I don't want to call it backsliding. What's the right term? There are some untoward things that appear to be going on in certain parts of the nonprofit sector. It turns out, if you have a big board of trustees and they don't make significant monetary contributions to the organization, they can be bought out. So there are instances of nonprofits sitting on hundreds of millions, and in some cases maybe billions of dollars, that have essentially been co-opted by outsiders by paying relatively paltry sums to a majority of the board to vote for their candidate to run the place.
Right.
There are nonprofits that are engaged in tunneling. That is when the leadership will form an outside entity and then funnel the organization's resources to that other entity, and then they extract the money. So there are nonprofit hospitals, for example, that 30 days after a bill is due, will put it out for collection. Yeah, because they own the collection agency.
Right.
And they're buying the hospital's debt for pennies on the dollar and making some pretty easy collections, because who hasn't been a little late on a hospital bill, especially given the way that the bills are structured, and you never know when the insurance is completed and that sort of thing.
Right.
So not perfect, and we need to look much more carefully at nonprofit governance. And maybe for some of these large nonprofits that get big sums from the government to do research, maybe we should rethink that model.
Right. Right.
Yeah, if you know what I mean.
Right. We have some questions coming in. So Clara Guda says, how should we encourage the formation of and participation in voluntary associations today? Particularly, how should we think about voluntary associations in place during a time when many people are transient?
Well, I don't know what with the transient, I mean, I suppose you think about the nonprofit in terms of the service it provides instead of in terms of geography, right? So back in the day, many of these were localized, but that's because communication costs were so high. Now communication costs are much lower, and people from throughout the whole world can meet together virtually like this. And we have email lists and whatnot, and maybe think about it more in terms of affinities, regardless of where people are at any given time, regardless of how transient they are. If they have stable affinities, stable interests, stable things that they want to do, then organize the nonprofits around that rather than locale.
Okay. Rachel Ferguson writes, in Seth Kaplan's recent book, Fragile Neighborhoods, he argues that horizontal connections are more powerful than top-down planning or pull yourself up by your bootstraps individualism. But our modern donor class seems very focused on measurable improvements that are supposed to be direct outcome of your efforts. Many of the associations described are powerful because of their secondary and tertiary effects. Is the hyper-focus on direct outcomes part of the reason we've lost these?
Hi, Rachel. Great question. Uh, I mean, could be. I think this effective altruism movement, though, is much more recent than the decline. I mean, when did Putnam's book come out? Like the 1990s, right? I mean, this has been something that's been happening, I think, since the Great Depression. Certainly, this effective altruism movement is not helping things, right? And I see it just as another form of rent seeking. So they look and they say, "Oh, wow, this third sector, we've never heard of it before," but there seems to be pretty large dollar figures floating around here. How can we co-opt the generosity of the American people, because we are very generous still? How can we co-opt that and turn it to our own ends? Well, let's say, yeah, a lot of charity goes for naught, but we know how, as men of system or women of system, to best direct it. Like it's a command voluntary association sort of thing. And yeah, I think that what we need to do there is just to reject it, and to recognize that voluntary association in regards to charity helps both the giver and the donor. Right. And I have some quotations in the book, I think, from like Truman and Eisenhower and whatnot to that effect. Goldwater as well, Barry Goldwater, in the run up to this 1960 election, made the same point, as do many religious organizations. So yeah, maybe you gave some money to somebody who was malingering, but that's not your fault. You got tricked, right? What's key is what's in your heart, which was good, right? And that's why you gave. So the sin is on their part, not on your part. And you gave up a real resource, right? You gave up time, or you gave up money, or you gave up, even though you weren't using it anymore, the stuff in the garage that you donated, that was turned into cash today, just like they did in the early 19th century, through sales and whatnot. And that is actual virtue, and not virtue signaling. Right? I think I have a no, or did I come up with it? The voluntary association is dying in a hail of hashtags.
Yep, I think that's your line.
Something along
Yes.
those lines. Yeah. where, people would just, oh, well, I tweeted about this, so I don't have to think about this anymore. And ain't I great? No, you're really not great. People who were great were people in the early 19th century who either started their own nonprofits or who joined existing ones and actually, help people with real resources. Many of whom, by the way, this hasn't come up yet, were women. We mentioned blacks, so this gave us a space for blacks to be social entrepreneurs. Well, women were also, largely excluded from especially the corporate for-profit sector. But they formed, even married women formed voluntary associations across this wide panoply that we talked about.
Right.
Yeah.
Mark Wheat asks, what are some of the oldest voluntary associations in the U.S. and how have their missions changed? And I will say there's a group about 15 minutes away from where I am in Berlin, Pennsylvania, which claims to be the oldest continuous music association playing music. Since 1783 is when they were founded, and they play like drums and flutes and stuff at local parades. They
Yeah.
claim to be the oldest one.
Yeah. There is one of these voluntary militia companies that we talked about that dates from the late 18th century in Massachusetts, an artillery company, which I ran across, interestingly enough, because of my interest in the Second Amendment, and claims that, oh, well, the founders didn't have cannons in mind. No, they did. They very much did. There was very widespread private ownership of cannons, some by individuals, but many through these nonprofits. Well, you mentioned Franklin earlier, the American Philosophical Society. Right. That's still around. The Philadelphia Contribution Ship, a fire insurance company, now more generally a property and casualty company that Franklin helped to found in the 1750s, is still around. In fact, I had a renter's insurance policy with them back in the 1990s when I taught at Temple University. Yeah, it was kind of cool. I mentioned the YMCA. That's from the antebellum period. There are some others I think I mentioned in the book. Unfortunately, finding exit data for a lot of these is tough. They didn't have to pass a law to say that they were going out of existence. They just went out of existence. So, a lot of historical societies formed in the, that probably still exist today. And probably haven't changed much, like the American Antiquarian Society or the APS, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. The technology's changed, but their mission is more or less the same. A lot of learned societies in the sciences as well.
Mark Roberts asks, what today most threatens voluntary associations? We talked about their decline. What's today is the biggest threat or continuing threat?
Well, I mentioned the hashtag hailstorms, where people just think that they're doing something because they're on social media, saying something or liking a video or whatever, instead of actually going out in the world and doing things. There seems to be like some sort of pandemic of social anxiety amongst young people, probably because of the COVID situation and the masks and all of that, that they were deeply hurt psychologically, and they just don't want to deal with people face to face anymore. And I suppose you could do some sorts of things online where they might be comfortable, but a lot of charity for sure is still hands-on, face-to-face sort of stuff. When I lived in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, I used to volunteer occasionally at something called the Banquet, which was a soup kitchen essentially. And you have to be there. You're the one serving the the food, right? So you can't do that virtually. So yeah, and just the continued usurpation of every dollar we earn by government, leaving less and less for us to share in ways that we want to share with the organizations we want to share. It's just, especially with this recent inflation and the the stress on people's discretionary budgets. It's just difficult to come up with the same sorts of cash for many people to donate. The time, that can be more difficult too. As our traffic congestion gets worse and worse in some places. If you have to travel 10 miles in the part of New Jersey that I'm in right now, it could take 40 minutes to do it. That, really that's time that's lost to volunteering. It's this whole sort of modern life that we're in, that just doesn't make it as alluring as it used to. Leave it for the government to take care of. I got to watch House of the Dragon. A new season just started.
That's right.
You know what I mean? A lot of distractions these days. When back in the 19th century, people would go to the Lyceum because there was nothing else to do.
There's one final point that Rachel Ferguson makes here. She talks about empathy being weaponized in social justice circles, but there used to be a kind of positive channeling of empathy towards actual service and that sort of thing. And that might be another layer here.
I agree.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Wright, very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
And thank you to our sponsors, the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Please visit kirkcenter.org to learn more about the Kirk Center. You can support the Kirk Center and the work of the University Bookman through the Kirk Center's website at kirkcenter.org/donate. Go to kirkcenter.org/permanent-things to sign up for the Kirk Center website email list. And I'll see you next time on the Book Gallery.